Over almost half-century of work, UNIDO has played a very important role in the development of thinking about development. As was mentioned this morning, next year is the 50th anniversary of UNIDO. It's particularly important for me in a way because this year is the 50th anniversary of my beginning to teach economics. And Columbia just had a big celebration of that 50th anniversary. So to think of myself as being in development economics 1 year longer than UNIDO is a little bit of a scary thought. From the very beginning, I've been involved with some of the issues on which UNIDO has been involved. In the very early days, one of the big issues that UNIDO was involved with was cost-benefit analysis, with the very influential manual on cost-benefit analysis by Sen and Dasgupta. And that work emphasized the concept of shadow prices, the differences between market prices and opportunity costs, emphasized market failures, problems of unemployment, and distribution. These were all ideas that were given short shrift in the neoliberal models that were then in the process of gaining ascendancy within the economics profession in general and the development subdiscipline in particular. I had the good fortune to work with both Sen and Dasgupta, in particular Dasgupta, on the issues of shadow wages, on discount rates, on the issues of distribution, on foreign exchange. And then a little later, another issue that UNIDO worked on, and still an issue that's relevant today, is the issue of appropriate technology. Technologies that were appropriate in the advanced countries might not be appropriate for the developing countries. And I'll come back to that theme in a little while. In the intervening years between those early years of UNIDO and today was a period in which the Washington consensus dominated. And unfortunately, in that period, there was a process of discrediting industrial policies. There was the belief that markets would solve all problems. My predecessor as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, Mike Boskin, was famously quoted as saying it made no difference whether a country produced potato chips or computer chips. You should just leave it to the market. But of course, I think he was wrong. It does make a very big difference to the development of the country, and there are large market failures in making those decisions. Then in 1997, I was in a sense dropped into the midst of the World Bank. And I have to say, at that time is when I met Director Liang. He was the executive director of China, and we worked on many issues together, including an extended visit to China that I still remember very, very distinctively. I was, to put it frankly, appalled by some of the ideas, the lack of recognition of the extensive market failures which characterize all economies but are particularly important in developing countries. Some decades before arriving at the World Bank, I had done some of my work for which I received the Nobel Prize, explaining why it was that the invisible hand was often invisible. The invisible hand was the idea that the pursuit of self-interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of everybody. And what I had shown was that the reason the invisible hand was invisible was that it wasn't there. That is to say that markets in general on their own did not lead to efficient outcomes, particularly problems of information imperfections, knowledge, many of the issues that are central to the issues on which UNIDO is engaged. These problems are present in all countries, but especially in developing countries. I was also a little bit appalled because the policies that were being pursued by the World Bank, and even more the IMF, were the opposite of the policies that I had been involved in and pushing inside the United States in the Clinton administration as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. So while the IMF and to some extent the World Bank opposed at that point industrial policies, in the American government, we were actually pursuing industrial policies. Many of those industrial policies were admittedly hidden in our Defense Department, but they were still important. If you think about the end of the 20th century, what were the most important innovations? They were ideas like the internet. And the internet was basically a result of the industrial policies on the part of the US government. It was a very successful industrial policy. It was a basis of what has continued to be one of the important sources of our economic growth. At the Council of Economic Advisors, we did a study of the economic returns to our investments in technology, we might say in investments in industrial policies, and they were very high, higher than the returns in the private sector investments, higher than returns in even private sector investments in R&D. So we thought we had a compelling case for the pursuit of industrial policies, including R&D policies, and an argument that we ought to be engaged in these activities more, not less. And yet, ironically, at the World Bank, at the IMF, the United States was pursuing exactly the opposite. It was discouraging those kinds of activities. Now, if you were a cynic, you might say, well, this was just the United States making sure that the poor countries remain poor. I don't think that that was really what was going on. I think it was a reflection of the differences that occur within any country, that the finance ministry, the US Treasury, officially didn't believe in industrial policies. I'll come back in a minute and point out that they actually did, but they were industrial policies for themselves. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Well, early in 1978, after having been at the World Bank for a year, I gave a lecture at WIDER, your sister UN institution, which I entitled Broader Objectives, More Instruments, in which I criticized the Washington Consensus policies of the World Bank. It didn't always settle well with the US government, but I viewed myself as an international civil servant, not working for any particular country. And when I had come to the World Bank, I said, I am working on behalf of the developing countries, emerging markets, and I would do what I thought was right. And if you wanted to fire me, you can, but that was the risk you were taking in hiring me. I was going to speak out on what I thought of were the interests of the developing countries. Well, what's interesting is that now, almost 2 decades later, the battle is largely over. The intellectual battle is largely over. although it has to be refought over and over again. I think the Washington Consensus, the set of ideologies, the set of views about how the economy operates, the set of policies, has been very largely discredited. The 2008 crisis, you might say, was the coup de grace. It showed that markets on their own were neither efficient nor stable. But well before that, a large body of research had explained all the ways in which the ideas behind the neoliberal model depended in a very sensitive way to very special assumptions which don't describe any country, but particularly don't describe a developing country. And in particular, don't help us understand some of the most important issues facing all countries, including developing countries. The countries that were most successful in development, and let me emphasize that there have been enormous successes in development well beyond anything that anybody had ever anticipated. The countries that were most successful in development, those in East Asia, did not follow the Washington Consensus. And the countries that followed the Washington Consensus suffered. So in particular, one of the questions I get asked very often, why did Africa do so poorly in the quarter century before 2000? Why was there this process of deindustrialization at the same time in East Asia there was this enormous success in industrialization? And while there are several factors contributing to it, the most important, I believe, was the structural adjustment policies that were imposed by the IMF and the World Bank that led to that deindustrialization. There were other factors that I think should have brought us to understand the limitations of that neoliberal and neoclassical model. That model tries to suggest that there is only limited importance to market failures, but global warming and climate change has made us recognize that there are some first-order important externalities, market failures, that are threatening the very survival of our civilization. So it's not only that there were conventional market failures exhibited in 2007 and 8, markets that had not managed risk, markets that were inefficient, markets that were unstable, but the world is not addressing the key issue of global warming. And there are other puzzles, you might say, strange things going on in the market economy. Innovation is not working in the way that it should. The world today clearly needs to have innovation to protect us against global warming and other environmental disasters. But innovation is directed today at saving labor. You might say, we have enough unemployment. Why create more unemployment? But markets are focused on creating more unemployment. Now, nobody would design rationally an economic system where you have massive unemployment of unskilled labor, and then you have people doing research to figure out how to create more unemployment of unskilled workers. It doesn't make any sense. And meanwhile, no attention, or no, very insufficient attention to the problems of saving the planet. A few years ago, Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, talked about a savings glut. He said there was too much savings. And when he said that, I thought he must be living on a different planet than I was living on. Because when I travel around the developing countries, or even when I go to New York, what I see is huge investment needs for infrastructure, for technology, for retrofitting the world, for climate change, for human capital. So I see huge investment needs, and yet Bernanke was talking about too much savings. So how do you reconcile those? Well, it's again another example of a market failure. One of the important markets in our economy, financial markets, is supposed to intermediate between savings and investment, but it's failing to do it. It's worse than that. The investment needs that we have in infrastructure, retrofitting the world for climate change, are long-term investment needs. Much of the savings is long-term. Sovereign wealth funds, people saving for their retirement. So you have the long-term investment needs, long-term savings, and in between, you have financial markets that are worrying about the next quarter or the next hour. So something is wrong where you have an economic system with short-term financial markets trying to intermediate between long-term investment and long-term savings needs. So all of these are examples of the ways in which clearly our markets aren't working well, examples of market failures, examples where there is a need for government policy. Well, the theme that I mentioned before that I talked about in the lecture I gave in January of 1998 was broader objectives and more instruments. And I've used that theme to talk about a number of other domains of economic policy, for instance, about monetary policy. And what I want to do this afternoon is explore that in the context of industrial policies. Now, when I'm talking about industrial policies, I mean not just industrialization as conventionally understood. That is to say, often when people talk about industrial policy, they think about manufacturing. But really what I'm talking about when I talk about industrial policy is promoting a whole range of non-traditional activities and non-traditional technologies. So for instance, UNIDO, we talked about this morning, is very involved in promoting clean technologies, clean energy technologies. Those are examples of industrial policies, whatever the sector that is involved in. So more broadly, my concept of industrial policy is any policy of the government to affect the sectoral composition or the choice of technology or the direction of innovation. And that can include energy policies, it can include modern service sectors, many different aspects of industrial policy. So today what I want to do is emphasize 3 or 4 simple points. The first is that all countries have industrial policies. It's just that some countries don't know it, and some countries don't own up to it. But all countries have industrial policies. The basic point is that markets don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be structured. And the way we structure markets works to the advantage of some sector relative to other sectors. All governments have to make decisions about expenditure policies and tax policies. And those expenditure policies and tax policies favor one industry over another, one technology over another. You have to make a decision about which infrastructure to invest. And those infrastructure decisions affect one over another. So let me just give you some example from the United States. And I mention this because many people in the United States have said that we don't believe in industrial policy. And what I want to explain is, yes, you do. You have an industrial policy. The industrial policy that we've had in the United States for the last 25 years has been to encourage the financial sector. It's distorted our economy. Take one simple law, our bankruptcy law. In normal countries, when you have a bankruptcy law, the bankruptcy law says who gets paid when the debtor can't pay all his debts. So you have to create a hierarchy, and some people get paid everything and some people get paid nothing. Well, in most countries, when you go into bankruptcy, the person who gets paid are the workers for a good reason. The worker can't get back his labor. You can't say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sell you my labor. Give it back. You can't get your time back. In the United States, though, when nobody was looking, they passed a law that said if you go bankrupt, the first claimant is derivatives. CDSs, those risky products that led to AIG going down. One company got a bailout of $180 billion. And for those of you who don't know about numbers, $180 billion is a lot of money going to one company. So that's an example of industrial policy. Even the policy of privatization is or can be an industrial policy. So it's favoring certain sectors over others in the way that it's done in certain parts of the economy. The result of those set of policies in the United States, the industrial policies that led to the growth of the financial sector, is that the financial sector grew from around 2.5% of GDP to about 8% of GDP with no evidence that the economy grew better. It had nothing to do with the growth of the economy. It was just an industrial policy that distorted our economy. We had a tax policy that encouraged land speculation. You might say, why do you want to encourage land speculation? Economists disagree about everything, but there's one thing they agree with. If you tax land at a lower rate, you don't get more land. And yet, we had a policy that said we tax land speculation at a lower rate than if you work for a living. Well, what did happen? It distorted. More of our resources went into land speculation. So we, as a teacher, I feel this very strongly. Our most talented students go into the financial sector, into real estate speculation, rather than into more productive activities. So all of these are on the broad theme of all countries have an industrial policy. And so what the focus of UNIDO should be is to try to help countries figure out what is a good industrial policy, one that will promote inclusive, sustainable growth that's consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's what I believe that it's been doing. The important thing when we think about growth is that we not confuse ends with means. And as we think about the broader agenda of industrial policies, we need to go beyond just the increase in GDP, which was the view at one time, to what UNIDO has been emphasizing, equitable, sustainable, inclusive development, climate change. When I gave my 1998 talk the language I used then is that we ought to be promoting equitable and sustainable and democratic development. And I think all these issues are related, that when you have high levels of inequality, it inevitably undermines democracy. So when I say we need a broader agenda, it's going beyond just the focus on GDP, and this, of course, was the major thesis, the major theme of the International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress that I chaired. It emphasized that GDP does not give us a good assessment of how well our society is doing. That report of that is published under the title, Mismeasuring Our Lives, Why GDP Doesn't Add Up. And I thought the title really summarizes a lot of what we're saying. There's a second aspect of the broader agenda that I want to talk about very briefly, and that is the agenda of structural transformation. Development is, to a large extent, a structural transformation. It's not just growth, it's changing the structure of the economy. And there are many dimensions to this structural transformation. We're going towards a green economy from a dirty economy. We're going towards a learning society, an innovation economy. And just to plug one of my more recent books, Creating a Learning Society, where I talk about how industrial policies can help structure the economy in ways that create, we said, a learning society because it's more than a learning economy. It's the way our whole society interacts with with ourselves. And so that's another part of the structural transformation. The learning economy and the knowledge economy, innovation economy is different from the old economy of the 19th, 18th century. This is an important point for those economists who go back and talk about Adam Smith. Adam Smith was writing at the end of the 18th century before the world became an innovation economy. There was no innovation in that period. He had no understanding of the importance of innovation. He talked about a pin factory. It wasn't about innovation. And the principles underlying an innovation economy are very different from those underlying a pin economy. So one has to be very careful in applying those principles. In the advanced countries, there are other aspects of a structural transformation, and I think one of the things that UNIDO has been very good at is emphasizing that the issues of industrial policy apply not just to developing countries and the least developed, but also to advanced countries. In advanced countries, we're moving towards a service sector economy. In the developing countries, they're going from agriculture to manufacturing. In all of our economies, we should be moving from a finance-based economy to a real economy. In most of our economies, especially in developing countries, there's a process of moving to an urban economy. This year marks the first year in which probably a majority of the world's population will be living in cities. And life in cities is different than rural life. And that's a very big transformation. It's one of the big issues in China's transformations. The fundamental point, like the earlier one, is that markets on their own don't make these kinds of transformation well. And there's good theoretical reason that I can't go into in this short talk why markets don't do very well in this kind of structural transformation. One of the simple reasons is that the sectors that are dying, people in those sectors don't have the capital to move into the new sectors. And financial markets in general are not very good at that kind of investment, lending to people who are doing very badly. So the imperfections of risk markets and capital markets are part of the fundamental reasons why markets are not very good in these structural transformations. So this is the agenda of, this is what I mean by broadening the agenda of what we mean by industrial policy. Well, there are other aspects of broadening the view of industrial policies. As I mentioned before, it's not just manufacturing. I think one has to take a realistic view about manufacturing going forward, and this will be important for anybody thinking about structural transformation. The overall number of jobs in manufacturing globally is going to be going down. And that's the result of the success of the manufacturing sector. Productivity in manufacturing is increasing faster than the output of manufacturing goods. And those two numbers, just the arithmetic says that employment in manufacturing is going to be going down globally. Now, that means that not everyone can have an increase in manufacturing jobs. That comes out of the arithmetic. That if total employment in manufacturing is decreasing, not all countries can plan to expand manufacturing jobs. Now, there will be a significant decrease in countries like the United States and Europe, and we are going to have to accept and adapt to that kind of decrease in manufacturing employment. And the failure to make that transition is part of the weaknesses right now in Europe and the United States. Some of the countries will be able to grab some of those jobs that are leaving the United States, Europe, and China, and UNIDO can play an important role in helping some of the countries in Africa, for instance, to seize a larger fraction of those jobs that are going to be moving out of where they are today. The increase in the cost of labor, changing comparative advantage, will mean that manufacturing will be moving elsewhere. There are some real advantages to developing a manufacturing sector. It is an important intermediate way of going from agriculture into more advanced economy. There are certain skills that one learns through the manufacturing. That's one of the theses of our book, Creating a Learning Society. There's a lot of learning that goes on as part of the manufacturing process if it's done in the right way. And I believe that many of the countries in Africa can succeed in doing this, and there have been some big successes. You were talking this morning about Ethiopia. Just in the shoe industry, there's 50,000 jobs have been created in the shoe industry, a real success in industrial development. There's some other aspects of the change that's going to be going on in industrial policy. In the success of East Asia, a lot of the focus was export-led growth. But one of the aspects of the global move to a service sector economy is that trade as a ratio to GDP will almost surely be going down. That trade went up when manufacturing was in its heyday, but service sector are traded less than manufactured goods. So the implication of this is that there will have to be other strategies than export-led growth for long-term development in many of the countries. So these are among the global challenges that are going to be facing the world as it thinks about industrial policies in the next quarter century. Finally, let me emphasize that two other problems. One of them is that if employment doesn't go up, inequality will increase. And if inequality increases, then aggregate demand will become weak. And that's one of the problems facing the global economy today. And if aggregate demand is going to be weak, then GDP growth will be weak. And we can get into a vicious circle. And it will be very important for us to frame policies that prevent this from happening. And that's why the emphasis on inclusive growth, inclusive industrial development is so important. It's going to be very important to make sure that the industrial policies create employment, that the benefits are shared widely, there's shared prosperity, if we're going to have sustained economic growth. The only sustainable economic growth will be shared prosperity. And the second general point has to do with innovation. I made some reference to it earlier in my talk, to the observation that something's very peculiar about the nature of the innovation going on today. But it's even more disjoint from the challenges facing the developing countries. For them, the real challenge will be job creation. But innovation that's focused on saving labor is going in exactly the wrong direction. So it's going to be more and more important for us to try to encourage innovation, which is focused on saving the planet, focused on protecting the environment, and less involved in saving labor. So as we look forward, I think about how do we think about industrial policies, this shaping of the direction of technology, I think is going to be very important. So in summary, what I've tried to emphasize is that we now not only recognize that there has to be industrial policies, but that industrial policies have a far broader agenda than just industrialization, narrowly defined, and far broader than just increasing GDP. The final topic I want to talk about is more instruments. What are the instruments that are at the disposal of governments, the international community, for promoting industrialization broadly defined? And here, what I want to emphasize is that there are actually multiple instruments, that there are some tensions between some of the global agreements and some of the more, the instruments that might be best suited. Countries are going to have to learn how to navigate this difficult terrain. So, and in some areas, there are going to have to be strengthening of traditional instruments and recognizing the important role that strengthened versions of traditional instruments can play as part of industrial policy. So let me just list through some of these examples that I have in mind. The first goes back to the point I made that going forward, one important strand of industrial policy should be creating a learning society. And what I've tried to do here with my colleague Bruce Greenwald is to try to define a broad agenda for creating a learning society. There are multiple strategies of doing that, and that have been successful in several countries. But I want to move on to talk about some of the tensions between some of the global agreements and the logic of modern economics. So if we go back to the years when I was a chief economist at the World Bank, one of the important aspects of the advice that we gave to countries and the programs that we supported was education. But most of the education, the advice that was given to countries was that they should focus their scarce resources in education on primary education. And that made some sense because resources were limited. You wanted to have egalitarian policies, fairness, and that meant giving everybody a small dose of education. But that policy actually was a recipe for making sure that countries didn't develop, because you weren't going to develop based on just primary education. You needed people who had secondary and university education. Korea realized that very early on in its development strategy. China recognized that. Most of the East Asian countries recognized this. And so one of the things that we did when I was as chief economist at the World Bank is that we changed that policy. We said, yes, primary education is important, but we have to have a broader education strategy, one that can help us succeed in have a successful industrial policy. A second example, the Doha round that began in 2001, still not completed, was supposed to be a development round. And that reflected the recognition that trade policy had not only not promoted development, but actually stymied development. And some of the new trade agreements are even worse. So what are examples? So one of the things that the advanced countries have done for a long time have what I call escalating tariffs. Lower tariffs on unfinished goods and higher tariffs on more finished goods. When you have this escalating tariff, it basically forces the developing countries to stay at the lower level of the value added, not to go up to the higher value added. It was a structure that the advanced countries used to try to keep the developing countries simply providing raw materials. And the development round was supposed to stop that. But unfortunately, the development round has not been concluded, and this issue remains. A third example is intellectual property. Intellectual property is part of an innovation system, but it's only part. But developing countries need a different intellectual property regime from the more advanced countries. There was an excessive focus on a one-size-fits-all framework. The World Intellectual Property Organization adopted in 2004 a resolution calling for a development-oriented intellectual property regime. It was an initiative of Brazil and Argentina. Unfortunately, again, nothing has come of this. But this is very important for the industrial policy of the developing countries. So these are all examples of some of the tensions. The natural instrument, some of the tensions between the global agenda, which is to some extent stifling industrial policy, and what developing countries and emerging markets need. Unfortunately, the WTO, the natural instruments for encouraging industrial development include subsidies. But the WTO makes it more difficult to subsidize these industries, even when there's positive externalities, even when the developed countries, at their earlier stages of development, engage in all kinds of subsidies. So the subsidies exist in the United States, buried in the Defense Department. There are certain categories of subsidies that are allowed in, for instance, R&D and infrastructure, but it makes it more difficult for developing countries. So the tools that the developing countries have to look for are other tools. And there are a couple of these. One of them is a competitive and stable exchange rate. China has used that instrument very effectively, a competitive and stable exchange rate. Now, some countries have resisted. They say, the United States say you shouldn't intervene in your exchange rate. Well, what I told one developing country where that view had a certain currency, where this was widely held, I say, the real question is whether the view is you should let the markets set the exchange rate. My response was, markets don't set the exchange rate. When the Federal Reserve Board lowers the interest rate or raises the interest rate, it affects your exchange rate. So the question is, do you want Janet Yellen to set your exchange rate, or do you want to set your exchange rate? The Federal Reserve is not the market. The Federal Reserve is a public institution in the United States. So this goes back to the point, every country has an industrial policy, whether they know it or not. And a competitive, stable exchange rate is an important tool of industrial policy. Another important set of tools are development banks. 20 years ago, the World Bank, even though it was a development bank, said development banks were not a good idea. I never understood that logic. But now we understand that there are many successful development banks. And we've turned the corner. There are some very important new development banks. The New Development Bank, the BRICS, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. These are all examples of important new development banks that are going to play an important role in providing finance for industrialization. A final point in this broad area of instruments is in promoting a sustainable industrial policy, we need a price of carbon. It should be obvious that the meeting in Paris ought to agree on the price of carbon. I've written it. Most economists have supported this view. There is only one minor political problem called the United States. And it's not likely that a price of carbon will emerge at this meeting. But I think developing countries and emerging markets and advanced countries that want to promote sustainable will have to have a price of carbon. The final point, just very, very briefly, is that there are some traditional instruments like antitrust policies that have not been thought of as part of industrial policies, but they are. Because when you think about industrial policies, what you're thinking about is how do you promote new industries, how do you promote entry? And if you have barriers to entry created by existing firms or existing, that is an impediment that you have to deal with. So not only do you have to deal with impediments like finance, you have to deal with impediments like antitrust. When I was at the World Bank, we formulated what was called the Comprehensive Development Framework, the CDF. And the idea was a very simple one. the issues of development are so complex that there's no magic bullet. You can't approach them with any single tool. You need a comprehensive approach. And what I'm suggesting here is that there ought to be a comprehensive industrialization framework, that you need to approach the problem of the strategies for industrialization with a comprehensive toolkit, adapting it to the circumstance of the individual country. So just let me conclude and say, congratulate you a little bit prematurely on your 50th anniversary, and to say that I think this expansion of this new framework that you adopted in Lima of sustainable and inclusive industrial policies is exactly the kind of expansion of broader agenda and more instruments that I think is absolutely necessary if we're going to get the kind of sustainable and inclusive growth and development that the world needs today. Thank you very much.